processing, wow, here I am. I'm at the point where I'm meant to be doing whatever I'm meant to be doing, and I'm not doing that, was quite hard. And I think that kind of plays into this pigeonholing of people who egg freeze, that somehow we're all kind of career focused. That's obviously hugely oversimplistic.
That's Catherine Hendy, one of our two guests who's talking about how she felt about her decision to freeze her eggs. And you'll also hear from Sophia Money-Coutts, creator of the podcast Freezing Time, as we have a really funny chat with both ladies, Kate and I, about our perceptions of egg freezing, how they feel about egg freezing, and what you really need to take on board if it's something that you're thinking about doing. Now, this is the last in our later years series. Kate and I are hoping to share one more episode before the end of 2020. And then we're going to be having a little break to make sure that what comes next is just what you need. Now, hopefully, Kate and I can do that in person. I'm actually recording this intro for you as the new tiers have been rolled out in the UK. So we'll have to wait and see. As I've said previously, every time I try to book a train ticket to see Kate, the restrictions change. So just watch this space. If we don't get to do it in person, we will be sharing a final episode before the end of 2020. Before you hear the episode, though, as you know, on the Fertility podcast, we're always trying to guide you towards the next steps when it comes to what you're going to do in your fertility journey. And we always look to work with people who are on the same kind of mission. So I just wanted to say thank you to Merck, who have been sponsoring this latest series of the Fertility podcast. They are a leading science and technology company with a rich history in the area of fertility. And with this experience, Merck has launched Bloom, a brand new website intending to provide you with information whether you're looking to start your family or grow it and you need some help on what you're going to do next. So to find out more, just visit merckbloom.com. So we've got two guests joining us on the podcast today. Catherine Hendy, co-founder of Elanza Wellness. She's also got an egg freezing app in beta, which we're going to talk more about. She's the author of Everything Egg Freezing and a fertility yoga teacher. And Sophia Money-Coutts, who's a journalist, a blockbuster selling author, as I heard you say in your podcast, and podcaster. Ladies, welcome to the Fertility Podcast.
Hello, thank you for having us. It's bonkbuster, not blockbuster.
Bonkbuster. That's hilarious. I heard it wrong.
I wish blockbuster. Well, hopefully blockbusting at some point, but yeah, mostly bonkbusting at the
Love
moment.
it. Sorry, that shows I haven't read your books, but that's even better.
That's fine.
So, first of all, how do you two know each other?
Well, we sort of met remotely, really. I listened to a podcast that Catherine did a while ago. It was when I was thinking about egg freezing, actually. And there were just so many brilliant facts that she sort of talked about in a very calm, sensible way, having been through it herself. And then she reached, I hate this expression, sorry, Catherine, sorry, everyone, reached out to me. I think, Catherine, obviously you'll know this, when I'd maybe started doing my podcast. So then we made friends via email.
We did, but I don't want to be the kind of person that jumps in and says, it's sort of dating style, no, you looked at me first. But actually, I think you reached out to me on email.
Yes, sorry, I didn't know if we were going to... Yeah, that's true. No, I did. When I was lining up guests, having heard... What podcast was it that I said I heard you on?
No, you can only mention your podcast, no other podcast.
Sorry, it's going to get really confusing now. How many podcasts? Yeah. We've all got our own podcast. Anyway, yes, I heard Catherine, and she was just so sort of fluent and articulate about egg freezing, and I sent an email and then didn't get a reply.
So this is actually the first time you've spoken since, in all honesty.
Well, yes, because actually we've emailed, but we haven't spoken properly. So there we go.
Well, Catherine, let's talk a bit about your personal experience of egg freezing and your book, because we're going to talk all about Sophia's podcast, and that's the reason that we're talking about. This is part of our later years series, and it's this whole idea of kind of you're over 35, what next? And I know that that's something that you were kind of hit in the face with, wasn't it, Catherine?
Yeah, exactly. This is really timely because last week I actually turned 35, had my 35th birthday on the day that we discovered Joe Biden became president. So that was quite a nice
step
forward for women's health, potentially. Yeah, it's something that I started thinking about even before the age of 35, although for a lot of people we're kind of taught that's this big cliff in terms of our fertility. But personally, I'd been married all throughout my 20s and then found myself single at 31. And so started thinking about it perhaps a little bit earlier than other people do, because I had this big kind of life crisis event that made me examine everything going forward, it's still something where I think we can have really uncomfortable feelings about finding ourselves, if not single, then definitely child-free in our 30s, when we've got this kind of ticking clock getting louder and louder. And I think as a group of people, even though it's getting way more common and everywhere you look, people are kind of turning to parenthood later, I think there's so many misunderstandings around people being child-free in their 30s and their 40s now, that it was something that I started being in that position, started researching quite a lot, started actually having conversations with friends and my peer group and people who are in the same boat. And from that, I kind of uncovered this whispered fact that people had started freezing their eggs. I had some friends who were a few years older and they'd done it. And I spoke to them about it and ended up going down the egg freezing path myself. But, it's something that's definitely not for everybody. And I think there are other paths that people can explore. We can go into some of those perhaps. But I think it's just a lot of people are taught that this is something that is, maybe a little bit shameful or a little bit awkward or a bit uncomfortable. And so as a result, everyone ends up kind of sticking their head in the sand and not properly assessing what the options are. And I just think if we start having conversations about, laying out our goals and our plans and figuring out what our options are a little bit earlier, then it just ends up being that you have more options on the table.
So you're also, Catherine, you're keen to highlight the latest evidence, aren't you, on this dreaded fertility decline. What have you discovered in all your research?
Yeah, well, there's a few things. I think that, and Kate can probably speak to this from a clinical point of view, but, this whole idea that at 35, your fertility clicks off like a light switch and all of a sudden you can't get pregnant is just not scientifically accurate. Fertility decline is a gradual slope and it starts when we're pretty young and then it gradually declines until menopause. But there obviously is a slightly more rapid decline post 35, but that still doesn't mean that it's impossible to conceive. It's just, it becomes a bit more difficult and the chances of miscarriage or chromosomal abnormalities rise. But, in real terms, that difference isn't huge. It's just if you're the person in that position, it obviously feels pretty huge to you, which is why personally, I wanted to kind of increase my odds, increase my chances in case I get into a position of needing to use frozen eggs in an IVF cycle.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Catherine, because it is a bit of a horror story headline, isn't it? This fertility falls off a cliff at 35. And I really try to get away from that. And I also think it's a lot to do with how well you're looking after yourself, perhaps in the earlier years. If you're thinking about your fertility health and not having huge amounts of sexual partners, trying not to smoke loads and drink loads, then you're doing all you can to actually hopefully improve your fertility a little. So I agree with you. I don't think it is necessarily this cliff and falling at 35. And I would like us to get away from saying that actually, because I think it's misleading.
Yeah, I think that there's now this huge body of evidence that says that, lifestyle interventions and generally having like a pretty healthy foundation can actually be really beneficial for reproductive health as well. So I think exactly to your point, I don't think that you can necessarily kind of lump everyone in. And I think Sophia's spoken about this quite a lot as well with regards to egg freezing, quote unquote, success rates that, there's really no such thing. Yeah. And it's a highly individual thing. It completely depends on, the biology and the lifestyle of the individual as much as it does the kind of general statistics. But like everything, when you lump an entire group of people into one statistic, you kind of can't necessarily get much of a measure on it for you yourself.
Just to put a little disclaimer here, we're not going to talk about the actual process of egg freezing, because for that you need to listen to Sophia's podcast, because what we want to do in this chat is hear from both Catherine and Sophia about their experiences. And Catherine, I was looking at a post you shared on your Instagram where you said you'd analysed 100 posts to find out what people were wanting to know about egg freezing. I thought it was really interesting because we're talking about the kind of misconceptions about it. What were some of the main things that you found?
Yeah, exactly. So it was hundreds really. We kind of deep dived into Quora and Reddit and all these kind of whispered areas where people are just getting a bit real. And it's a huge question people have is, am I the right age? And what are the pros and cons? And what are the costs? Obviously, that's a big one. The reason that we did that is we were, speaking to loads of people, they were saying it's really hard to figure out whether this is for me. I don't know if it's something that I should be considering. And so we kind of computed all of that into what we call a decision tool for egg freezing. So we've made a virtual workshop. It's online. I can share a link if anybody's interested in checking it out for people to take. It takes an hour, and it's a workshop that you go through that kind of helps you on your way, and it's doctor approved, and it's got stories of different people in there. But yeah, out of those hundreds of questions, the really interesting thing that jumped out was this pros and cons question, because there really is that sense of weighing all the different things up. There is no one definitive right answer. It's not like, yes, at 35, if you're in this situation, you should freeze your eggs. It's an individual decision with loads and loads of different inputs. And so we're just trying to sift out what all those different inputs are and help people down the path of figuring that out for them personally.
It's so important to remind everyone that it's so not one size fits all with any of this.
So can we kind of talk about kind of going back a little bit as well, and about testing, fertility testing before egg freezing, and really love your opinions on it. Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? And Sophia, I know you kind of talked about this in the podcast. What are your thoughts?
I thought for a very long time about whether even to have the fertility test. It's basically the first step that you do before egg freezing, because it works out your hormone levels and has a look at your ovaries to see how sort of perky they're looking. And yeah, my sister and I actually, I remember debating this for ages, long before I turned 35 and had my eggs frozen, really in my early 30s. You know, I think I started getting targeted on Instagram with, you know, have our fertility MOT test kind of thing. And do you want to know at that stage? Is it, you know, do you want to know and get bad results and then freak out? Is it better to sort of be in blissful ignorance? That was a big call in itself. So I sort of psyched myself up for a couple of years, even really to do that. And then I had a minor panic because when the clinic who did the test got in touch with me with the results, I got an email. It was Z2S clinic, and I got an email from Z2 going, "Hi, Sophia, I've got your results. Are you around for a chat?" Which is never one of those emails that really, I was instantly like, right, I'm barren. And so I'm still not really sure if I do want babies, but I'm probably not going to have babies now. So I'll just get a Dachshund and that's all right. I'll be fine. And I'd had all these thoughts I'd obviously hit reply to Zita and be like, yes, I'm around, whenever, call me whenever. And in the 3 minutes that it took her to call me, which felt like 3 years, I'd made all these decisions about where my life was going to go. And then actually my results were completely fine. They were very, very average. And that was really then what made me think, okay, I've now done this. They're pretty average. The next step is, you know, do I really want to do egg freezing? Can I afford it? Can I face it? Etc. So for me, I think it was quite a helpful thing to do. I think I had my fertility test in the end when I was 33, about to be 34.
Yeah, I think for some people it's a useful thing to do, isn't it? But it's filled with so much anxiety waiting for that call. Yeah. For sure, totally. Definitely.
Something that's quite interesting around fertility testing is this sense of whether you go to a fertility clinic straight up, which is slightly, you know, an alien thing to consider for lots of people. It definitely was for me.
Really true. Yeah, you just think, why am I here?
Yeah. And then that kind of weighed up with, obviously there's loads of kind of consumer options now, like at-home hormone tests and things. And I think that can be quite confusing for lots of people, which is, well, do I need to go to a clinic? Can I do it at home? And just totally personally here on that, I feel like for the cost of lots of these things and just for the peace of mind of actually having somebody who knows what they're talking about and counselling you, for my money, I would just go straight to a fertility clinic and get the test done, because the gold standard of ovarian reserve testing isn't actually just the hormone test. It's a hormone test in conjunction with that scan of your ovary. So I think that that's something that people should maybe consider a little bit about.
Yeah, I totally agree.
It's interesting that you make that point, and I do agree. However, Kate and I have talked quite a lot about the benefits of home testing, in that the people that are that fearsome of walking through a fertility clinic door and therefore keep their head in the sand and don't get checked, it's more enabling as a starting point, you know. So I think there's definitely two arguments to that, because we do know that more people, especially with men as well, we know that there is possibly more of a take-up of those kind of tests that aren't really very nice doing in a clinical environment. So I hear you, Catherine, and I match you.
Yeah, and I think any test is better than no test. And for those people that really can't face doing it in a clinic, then I think at least you get some information, don't you? And an idea then to go forward, and hopefully that would then make them feel happier to go and have a full-on test. But I think any test is better than no test.
Yeah.
Sophia, I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned early in the podcast about how you had some previous kind of gynecological issues and you had a fear of your own fertility health. And you talked about how that possibly was quite a common thing with women. And I just wondered if that was something that you talked about with your peers, and Catherine, whether you'd had conversations. I personally hadn't really had conversations like that with my girlfriends. I have got very good girlfriends who sadly, like me, have had to go through the IVF route, but I don't think, maybe one or two actually, when I think about it, were worried about what might happen, but I didn't think it was a kind of common conversation. Do you hear more conversations about people having that fear of what could be?
I think in my own friendship group, it's hugely dependent. The ones who would be open about this kind of stuff anyway, about having IVF, have been open about it. You know, there's always those friends who you suspect might be going through something, and perhaps you find out later, you know, all being well, say if they've had a baby, then, you know, they then talk about it afterwards. It really varies friend to friend, I think. At least that's what I've found. I'm obviously very sort of heart on sleeve and put absolutely everything about my gynecological history, or have put everything out there, because I think the more that this kind of stuff is talked about, the better, you know, whether that's a smear test or IVF or what have you. But I do get that it's totally a very individual choice. I think probably more women are starting to talk about it more. And that was the whole reason that I made my podcast when it came to egg freezing. But again, you know, it's very, very, very private, intimate subject matter. So each to their own, really.
And then obviously, once you made the decision to start treatment, you started initially with Zeta West, or at least you were having conversations with Zeta West, and then you decided quite early on to change clinics, and you found the lovely Dr. James. That's in quotation marks because that's what you said, at the Lister. And I'm just intrigued, kind of what made you change clinics, and how important was it for you to find a doctor that you felt really, really comfortable with and perhaps had a bit of a crush on?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I think I was introduced to Zeta when I was writing a piece at some point, and that's why I did my fertility test there. It wasn't really that I changed clinics for egg freezing, more that while her clinic offers it, they don't really specialize in it. So I decided, and I did go there and talk to them about doing egg freezing there. It's going to be more expensive at Zeta West than it was at the Lister where I had it done. So I decided on the Lister. I went to an open evening. I really recommend. I mean, it's tricky at the moment. I don't know how many places are managing to hold open evenings. They're probably all remote now. I went to a Lister open evening, which really massively helped. Not only because the lovely, handsome Dr. James was presenting it. If anyone wants to listen to my podcast, you'll get running gags about Dr. James and me not shaving my bikini line before the operation, etc., etc. But A, because I'd actually taken a friend of mine into the Lister to have her egg collection operation the year before. And B, I really did, well, B, I loved all the staff. They're amazing from, you know, top down. Everyone was incredibly friendly. And I really didn't feel like I was part of a factory line there. That was one thing that I really noticed at the Lister. I think some clinics, they sort of do women with egg freezing. People are done sort of in batches, and they put you on the pill so that you can all start on one day. And I just, the Lister, it didn't feel like that at all. And see their lab, you know, someone else, and you guys all know this very well, someone else said to me, it's really about the quality of the lab. And I know the Lister have been doing this for a very long time. So all those reasons, really. It took me a while to decide for good that's where I wanted to do it. But
well, I have to say, I always hear from my patients really, really good things about the Lister, and I've particularly heard that their open evening is really good as well. So they've got it nailed.
So, yeah, that's
One of the things that I'm always really keen to kind of gauge is the emotional toll of any of this decision making. And I haven't listened to all of your series, Sophia, but I have dipped in on certain episodes. And one of the ones that I was interested in was where you talk about egg versus embryo. And I felt that there was this kind of, well, I wondered if there was a slight regret that you hadn't processed the idea of creating embryos to freeze and having time to think about a sperm donor before you froze your eggs. And I wonder, Catherine, as well, whether that was a part of your thought process and how you both feel about it, and also if you did both get emotional support along the way with this.
When it comes to me, yes. I thought I'd get around 10 eggs based on my fertility test beforehand and my scan. I ended up getting 22. If I had known that I was going to get 22, I'm pretty sure I would have frozen some as embryos. I'm obviously delighted that I got 22 and I got way more than I hoped, and it saved me from going through another round of it. I just think that would have been probably the most sensible option sort of going forward, as it were. But I didn't. And, I think sperm banks can move incredibly quickly these days. And after about a week of my injections, it was looking quite good. And I was like, oh gosh, should I do it? Should I just sort of quickly go on a sperm bank? But I think the one thing that you probably shouldn't panic by is sperm. And I just thought, well, do you know what? I probably should, I make decisions quite quickly in life, but I just thought, actually, do you know what? This one, I should probably take my time over and really consider this rather than just going on some website and quickly ordering it. So I decided not to. So I frozen 22 eggs. I spoke to Dr.
No Danish Viking sperm.
Well, maybe at some point, maybe when I come for them in a few years, I'm quite up for that. I kicked myself a little bit, but overall I was so pleased that I got way more than I thought, that it didn't seem too much of a drama really. But yeah, with hindsight, if I'd known, then I would have sorted that out.
What about you, Catherine?
So yeah, I find it a surprisingly emotional process. I think because I was kind of dealing with a lot of stuff in my personal life at the time, but physically for me, side effects wise, it was totally fine. I was one of the lucky ones, didn't have sort of major physical side effects. But emotionally, I think processing, wow, here I am, I'm at the point where I'm meant to be doing whatever I'm meant to be doing, and I'm not doing that, was quite hard. And I think that kind of plays into this wider characterization or pigeonholing of people who egg freeze, or actually just people who are child free in their 30s and 40s, that somehow we're all kind of career focused and we've chosen not to go down a particular path because we're chasing money or prestige or whatever it is instead. And I think, that's obviously hugely oversimplistic, but also just makes people maybe sort of bury some of the processing that they have to do around it. I actually read something interesting this morning, which was a piece by Jenny Murray in the Daily Mail talking about, she was criticizing an investment that a prominent venture capitalist firm has made in a startup that helps companies offer fertility benefits to their employees. And, the usual characterization was there, which is, this is terrible because it's going to make people not have babies. But actually, only, I think research has shown 1.5% of people who freeze their eggs say they did it because of anything to do with their career. The vast, vast, vast majority of people are doing it because they haven't found the life partner that they want to raise a child with. And the preference for most people is still to bring a baby into the world in a stable partnership. Obviously, people choosing to be single parents by choice is hugely growing, and there's not stigma attached to that in the way there was before. But still, personal preferences to be partnered for loads of reasons, the economics of it being a huge one if you live in a big, expensive city. And I think that not slamming Jenny Murray, obviously she's an incredible person who's worked in a load of issues that relate to women and women's health for many years, particularly over Women's Hour. But I just thought that was such an example of somebody reactively looking at a stereotype of a group of people rather than understanding the nuances of it. And it's something where a company offering fertility benefits, very often that includes IVF and egg freezing and a whole slew of family-friendly policies like extended
it's the policy side.
Exactly. So they're actually quite family-friendly environments. I mean, personally, I think it's something where if you haven't yet had kids, or if you're single in your 30s, maybe looking to, if you're changing jobs, looking at the family building policies a company offers and the benefits around that is quite a good thing to do. Because great, if you're getting to the point where you're thinking about freezing your eggs, or you're anticipating, I haven't met someone, I'm not likely to have a child over the next few years, and maybe IVF is on the horizon in the future, I think it's a great thing to move to a company that offers that as a benefit. It's a really expensive process, prohibitively so for a lot of people. So, yeah.
Just on both of your personal kind of decision-making processes of freezing your eggs, was the conversation of, Sophia, you talked about James explaining the success of, of embryos, of freezing embryos, treatment after that. Was that conversation a part of your experience? Were you told that information?
The embryos thing?
Yeah. I'm trying to gauge whether both of you thought about embryo freezing, or was it just egg freezing and that was too much to kind of contemplate what sperm donation meant in the whole mix?
Well, the way I came to it was actually my stepmom, who, when I first said I was thinking about egg freezing, said, well, darling, she's very forthright, my stepmom. I love her to death, but she is very direct. And she said, well, darling, if you're going to do that, you must freeze some embryos. And I was like, whoa, hang on, that is emotionally and also financially, you know, another jump ahead. That sort of, you're already admitting if you're doing egg freezing, as Catherine has said, that you're potentially not where you thought you might be at a certain stage in life. And then obviously freezing embryos, you're also admitting, if that's sort of the wrong word really, but opening the door to the fact that you might not meet anyone in the years that you sort of have left, as it were, and therefore you might sort of choose to do single motherhood by yourself. And initially I reared up a bit at that, and then the more I thought about it, the more, I mean, I'm still mulling it over now. I sort of think about it every day really at the moment. And so I sort of started thinking about it, and then I asked, basically every single time I saw poor Dr. James, I asked him about the embryo thing. And he, you know, should I do embryos instead of, or should I do embryos as well? And he said he couldn't stand, his answer was always that he couldn't stand up and recommend egg freezing to a room full of women if there was such a huge difference between the quality of freezing eggs and freezing embryos, which is true. But obviously, you know, I interviewed women for my podcast who they froze 14 eggs and 22 eggs, 2 women, and they both ended up, you know, those eggs didn't work for either of them. Whereas, you know, potentially had they frozen embryos, they might at least have known that they had, you know, viable embryos. So I go round and round in my head about this. I think it's something to consider. It's obviously a very difficult jump to make if you're already feeling a bit wobbly about egg freezing.
Yeah, I think it's really complicated. I personally didn't consider it. It was maybe something that, no, I don't even think it's something that I really discussed with Lucy Doctor. I was pretty young at the time when I froze my eggs in terms of people egg freezing. I was 31 or 32. And so I kind of felt like there's quote unquote enough time where it's likely that I'd meet somebody. I think had I been older when I was freezing my eggs, then potentially it's something that I would have considered a lot more closely. But I also kind of think that that's an interesting point around if somebody is reaching that point, then I suppose it's kind of, you know, maybe the argument is why freeze embryos with donor sperm if actually you could try to conceive right now with donor sperm at that point of being so ready that, you know, you don't want to wait.
So let's kind of go back to, Sophia, your treatment. And you had your treatment, which I followed avidly throughout the whole podcast.
Good, thank you.
And what really struck me then, and I really wanted to raise it with you because I hear about this all the time, is that you were quite shocked not to be followed up after your treatment. And you also mentioned about, you thought, oh, you know, is this just an egg freezing thing? And I'm sure women who are having IVF are followed up. But I often hear women saying that they feel completely abandoned even after IVF, and particularly women who miscarry as well, actually feel really abandoned. I was just curious to kind of think, what difference would it have made to you had there been that follow-up?
It would have made a difference, certainly. I felt rougher. The week after my egg collection, I felt really grim. I felt more grim than I had at any point before, to the extent that I did actually call the lister at one point to say, please, can I come off the antibiotics and the cabergoline, the anti-OHSS drugs, because I thought I'd done so much Googling. You know, we're all not supposed to Google and go in these forums, but we all do Google and go in these forums. And I had convinced myself that these were the drugs that were making me sick, and if I could come off them, I'd feel better, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I got in touch with the lister myself, and it is very odd. And they were sweet, and they said, I mean, they told me, they said I did have to, the nurse was very sweet and said I should stay on the drugs. So I did for one more day.
That made me laugh so much.
Didn't you stay on the drugs for one more day and then went on a massive bender?
I just could not stop
totally
laughing.
Self-inflicted more nausea.
As I say in the podcast, you know, really indicates I'm not ready to have a baby yet, I don't think, especially by myself. So no, I think it would have been kindness. I think clinics should check in really with anyone, you know, obviously I'm speaking about egg freezing, but in the few days afterwards, a call, I think at the very least, would be appreciated, because in the couple of weeks leading up to your collection, you're in touch with them every other day. You know, it becomes this, you know, very close relationship, but there's a relationship there. And then suddenly you have your operation and you go home and you hear nothing. And it just feeds into this narrative, I think, that, you know, that fertility clinics are only out there to get us through the door and get our cash. I think it's not very helpful for them to just suddenly go, right, out you go. and never to hear from them again. Dr. James has said the Lister is looking into basically going to introduce a courtesy call for women who are having egg freezing. So they ring sort of 3-4 days afterwards. So I think I just missed out on that. But I do think that clinics should really consider
I was going to say, I think, to be fair to the lovely Dr. James, when you spoke to him, he did say that they had started to put that into process, which I think is so important. And also, when you kind of first investigated the treatment at the Lister, because obviously you talked about the extra costs that you suddenly found yourself facing with medication costs. And I know that from, talking to others, that can come as a bit of a shock. Were your clinic transparent right from the off about those extra costs? Because there's kind of stuff happening at the moment that I think are probably going to make clinics become more transparent about that process.
Oh, good.
How transparent did you find the clinic?
I think, like a lot of clinics, the Lister quotes a price, 3,000, call it 3,700 for one round, or, that sort of bog off offer of 3 rounds for £10,000. But it's not, it wasn't very obvious in the literature, I have to say, that drug costs and blood test costs come on top of that. It was explained to us very clearly in the open evening that they would be extra, depending on your own hormone levels and how much, Menopur or whatever you may be on, you need. But no, I do think clinics, again, should be more open and upfront that the quoted price isn't necessarily what you end up paying, because these are, big numbers that, lots of women, it's finding those sums is not easy. And then to suddenly learn, with me, it was basically another 1,200 quid, I think, on top of the quoted price. You can't just sort of whip that up suddenly. So yeah, I think they should be more open.
I agree. Completely agree.
Catherine, I'm interested in your experience of emotional support, that kind of follow-up with you. And also I know that that's part of the work that you're doing with Elanza in terms of kind of day-to-day access to support. What was your experience like?
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly why me and my co-founder Britt, who is American based in San Francisco, why we came up with Elanza in the first place. Is to address what we personally felt were massive, painful gaps in the treatment process, because, the clinical side of things is just one thing, but as we've been discussing, there's so many other factors that surround fertility. It's not just another medical procedure. It's, the cost portion we've spoken about, but also, your life goals, relationship, career, kind of where, like, sort of how you're processing where you are at that stage in your life. There's a lot that goes into it. As we've discussed, there's so many different paths that you could be taking at that moment. Do you want to freeze your eggs, or do you want to consider donor sperm and single parenthood? Do you want to kind of think, actually, let me see what happens, let me take care of myself sort of lifestyle wise, and I'm open to the idea of adoption or other routes to parenthood in the future? You're wrestling with some huge, huge, huge questions at this kind of crux point where you're also choosing whether to spend a huge amount of money, which, as Sophia pointed out, is not always clear cut either, which makes it even more stressful. So yeah, the emotions of it, I think, are twofold. There's that kind of decision-making paralysis and all that goes into that. And then there's just the highly personal kind of existential life stuff that's going on at the same time. And, something that Britt and I discussed was, is it right to expect all of that from our doctor and from our clinic? And actually for us, the answer was no. I think we did a huge piece of research, and most of the people that we spoke to said that they expected to be able to access resources like that from their clinic, but it shouldn't necessarily be the reproductive endocrinologist or, the fertility specialist who's the one doing that. That's not their core competency. That's not what they spend years in specialist medical training for. I think it's a wider framework that clinics should be really aware of, which is, to put a terminology on it, the patient experience. But I think it goes beyond the clinical. And so it's something that we're working to develop a kind of protocolized way of providing all of the extra emotional, practical, and lifestyle support that people like us really, really crave throughout treatment, that plugs into what your clinic's doing, but isn't something that they should necessarily have to come up with themselves.
No, it's something Kate and I both do in the kind of emotional support that we work with people doing, because there is that gap. And I think you're totally right in that you can't expect everything from, you want that person to be a specialist in that area, don't you? And you want that emotional support, but it to be very clear as to where you can get it. On the flip side of this, though, because I want to kind of focus on the positive of what you've both done in light of we've been in the midst of a pandemic for nearly the time in which you might be able to be pregnant for and have a baby. When you think about the decisions that you've both made, and Sophia, I know you joked about kind of dating, and Catherine, I don't know what your situation is, but you would also talk to a lady that had frozen her embryos and had recently kind of got into a relationship. I just wondered how you feel about both of your decisions now that we've had this huge chunk of our lives where everything's been restricted and you've not really been able to meet anybody. Yet here you are, having both taken these measures to extend the ticking clock and broaden the jump off the cliff, so to speak.
Speaking for me, yes, I feel very lucky and grateful because I got 22 eggs in one round. I think, obviously, had I not, there are plenty of women who aren't as fortunate, then I would have found it a less positive experience. But yes, I'm sort of still on Hinge, but I'm not really applying much enthusiasm to it, I have to say. So it's weird, having frozen my eggs, I've almost written off dating. I sort of can't be bothered. I mean, obviously we're not allowed to at the moment, but I sort of can't really be bothered. And having my eggs in the freezer, I'm definitely more relaxed about that than I have been for a long time. I obviously anticipated that, and I anticipated the relief because, I'd been reading about it for a long time and I've got friends who've gone through it before me. But even knowing all that, I still did feel this sort of wave of relief really having done it. And it does feel like, God, yeah, in this year of all others, at least that's, an achievement that I can sort of tick off. So, yeah, I feel very, very positive and grateful, really, which is why those mad headlines about success rates and it all being a huge con drive me particularly mad, because I think it's very unhelpful and reductive to other women who might be thinking about it. So, no, on the whole, I feel, lucky and grateful, I would say.
So through this process, Sophia, you've kind of, or both of you, I guess, you've stared the option of solo motherhood right in the face, haven't you? And the fact that, what that might mean for you. Do you look at that slightly differently now? Do you feel more confident that if that had to be the route that you went down, say, and I know you talk about in the podcast about, maybe in 3 years' time, that might be a decision you have to make. Do you feel more confident about that now?
I do and I don't. It sort of depends what day you ask me, to be honest. Sometimes I feel a bit broodier than I do at others. I had my sister's dog for 2 days last weekend and it made me feel less broody, I think, than I ever have.
I love that.
So I really don't know. My big question, I really do think about this every day, is my overriding fear not having children and therefore having sort of somehow less of a life somehow? And is that fear of regret enough to make you want to have a child in the first place? Is that incredibly selfish? I don't know. I go round and round and round in my head about this. And I've written before actually about, I look at like my friends' babies, and sometimes it's a bit like, I feel like it's like squeezing an avocado in the supermarket to see how ripe it is. I look at the baby and I try and think, is that making my ovary sort of twitch? What sort of response am I having to that? And I feel quite lucky in a way that I don't have any overriding sense of a biological clock, because I think it allows me to think maybe a bit more clearly. So I don't know is the short, long answer, both. I'm just thinking about it. I'm very lucky. I've got my family incredibly supportive. My stepmother is desperately urging me onto sperm banks pretty much every day. So they would rally round. I just don't know. And also this year, having not been out very much, I sort of definitely want a year of traveling and doing fun things, I think, before I go down that route, I think.
What about you, Catherine, in light of what this year's been like and where you're at?
Yeah, I really, really, really empathise with that. I think you described that completely perfectly. But I think something that's been interesting for me is heard from quite a bunch of people who were on the fence about egg freezing, and the pandemic lockdown, the kind of dating hiatus has made them pull the trigger and do it. And that sense of buying a bit more time to be able to figure things out, I think, is pretty real. The other thing that's really interesting, and this is super anecdotal, and it happened to me, and it's something that, we've come up with a weird little name for. So I think it was one day after I froze my eggs, I moved country. And one day after that, I went on the first date with the man I live with.
Oh my God.
And it's a kind of weird thing where a whole bunch of people that I've spoken to have said, slightly annoyingly, right after I froze my eggs, I actually ended up getting into what's now quite a serious or a long-term or looks to be heading that way relationship. So my co-founder and I have started calling it the egg freezing Cupid effect.
I like it.
Well, yeah, do you know what? I've heard that as well. And I'm now 4 months on from freezing my eggs, and he has yet to show himself, I have to say.
Ladies, thank you. Really interesting hearing how you're feeling about it and how the experience was for you. And I think one of the kind of main things that we want to highlight, as we always do with the Fertility Podcast, is just get all the information from a credible source, which is what we try to bring to you. And I know, Sophia, you put in a ton of work in the different conversations that you pulled together. And when we talk about those shock headlines, you just feel the frustration, and you just want people to at least spend the time just listening a little bit more, because it is empowering as something that we can do, but it is a choice and it's not necessarily right for everybody. And some people, as you've both talked about, have positive experiences and others don't. There's no guarantee, but you talk about the weight being lifted, and I think any of these proactive decisions that we can make in terms of our fertility ultimately are going to give us that,
100%.
aren't they? So make sure you check out the show notes in your favourite podcast app, where we'll put links to Sophia and her podcast, and Catherine and her app, as well as their socials, and mine and Kate's as well, to make sure that you don't lose track of any of us. Be sure to subscribe in your favourite podcast app, because as I said at the start, we have one remaining episode to share with you in 2020. And then Kate and I are having a bit of a break. So as long as you're subscribed, you'll know exactly when we're going to be back with you. We've got some brilliant content, of course, planned for 2021 in what we hope will be a much more straightforward year for all of us. Thanks as always for your support, and until the next time.